Okay, so today we're going to look at Pebble Analysis, which is another technique that you can use when you're investigating beaches. So beaches can be described and differentiated by the character of the material that makes them up and the features that are found in their profile. I've looked at measuring the profile. The most common characteristics to look at are the slope of the beach, the texture of the beach, whether it's gravel, coarse sand, fine sand that forms the beach, and the composition of those particles. And you can probably see, even just looking at this beach, that the sort of size and shape of those particles is going to change as we go down the beach. In the previous lesson, we looked at measuring the slope of the beach, and geographers have proposed that there's a number of things which would influence the angle of a beach slope. The most important are the wave energy, which we're going to look at next, and the size of the particles on the beach. So you might investigate the relationship between these things on a particular beach. As I said, we're going to look at measuring wave energy later, but in this lesson we're going to see how we can measure and analyse the size and texture of material, the sand and pebbles on the beach. Stones that make up a beach vary in size, but they might also show changes in their shape and their roundness. There's a general pattern of sorting that would see stone sizes getting smaller further down the beach. But the ridges and troughs which your beach profile showed might interrupt this pattern, and it might cause different material to be found at different parts of the beach. This is a key that we can use to sort of show or assess how well sorted or poorly sorted material on a beach is. Grain size is also important because it's going to control the speed that the water percolates into the sand, and that affects the amount of water in the surface backwash and the amount of water that's returning through the beach sediments. And that's going to shape the beach foreshore and the gradient of that foreshore, because the amount of surface return flow is a factor in the movement of the sand grains on the beach. And if you stand at the water's edge and you look at the backwash, you can see the grains of sand moving over the surface with the backwash. Coarse sand beaches with a high degree of percolation will have steeper gradients than fine sand beaches because they've got less surface backwash, and therefore there's going to be less seaward movement of the grains. It's all about this infiltration rate, the rate at which the water can percolate through the material on the beach. Individual particles will suffer progressive change in size and shape due to processes like abrasion and attrition, as they're bumped together by the swash and the backwash and solution, and those processes that you learnt about at higher. So if you study the size and the shape of particles, it might throw a light on the process or processes that are happening at the beach either now or in the past. Geographers can learn a lot about coastal processes by examining the size and the shape of particles. Even a basic collecting and measuring exercise can create an understanding of the roles of erosion, transportation and deposition. For example, how round a pebble is can indicate the amount of attrition. That's where the particles are made rounder and smaller as other particles come into contact with them. Whereas freshly shattered fragments derived from cliffs are sharp and angular, attrition and abrasion, the wearing away of the particles as they hit solid rock, such as a cliff face, makes the particles smaller and more rounded. So there's been a lot of research papers and methods came up with for assessing the size and shape of particles by geographers. And the best way to do it is still sort of debated and argued over. There's a whole field of geography called sedimentology, which can be studied, which looks at those kinds of things. And it's a bit more exciting than it might first sound because, for example, sedimentologists would be the ones that are called in to analyse the size and shape of particles on Mars, and were able to work out that water once flowed there. However, one of the most important tasks of sedimentology is to sort the infinite number of possible pebble shapes into suitable classes. Three-dimensional shapes are particularly hard to describe, so geologists have developed different classification schemes to make this easier. You can imagine trying to describe the exact shape of a pebble. It's quite difficult. There is still a lot of debate over the best way to do this, but all of the classification systems usually require the measurement of the three principal axis lengths, A, B and C, of the pebble. So if we look at this diagram, the A axis is the longest side, in other words the length. So if we're thinking about it on a person, the A axis of a person would be their height from head to toe. The B axis, the second longest side, or the intermediate axis as it's sometimes called, is the width. And the B axis of a person would be a measurement from shoulder to shoulder. The C axis then is the shortest side, in other words, the thickness of the pebble. The C axis of a person would be from front to back through their belly button. It's important that you know and understand what axis we're measuring. And they can use these axis measurements to come up with lots of different forms of classifying and analysing the shape of pebbles. If you think about those three axes that you've been asked to measure, what you're really measuring is the pebble as if it was a cuboid. And sort of you're then classifying the different shapes on that. We are particularly going to look at this Zing classification later on, which is based on those three measurements. So for measuring large coarse sediments, you can use calipers like these, but it's only really good for reasonably large stones. Or you can use a ruler or just a measuring tape. But for very fine material like the sand, we'd have to use a different method with sieves and things like that, and we're going to look at that next lesson. To carry out the sampling, you need to collect sediment samples from different sites up or along the beach. Again, you would need to decide on the right sampling strategy, and we're going to look at how you choose that later, but it could be, for example, that you sampled sediment size and shape at each of the measuring points along the beach profiles that you took. You'd need to take 10 pieces of sediment per location as the minimum number that you should collect. Because remember that the purpose of a sample is to get an idea of what all the sediment at that place is like. So out of all the pebbles on that bit of beach, 10 would still be a very small sample. Another technique you could use would be to put down this, which is a quadrat, and maybe just take one pebble from each of the small squares in the quadrat, and that would give you a way of sampling the sediment size at each of the points on your beach profiles. So that is basically how you do pebble analysis, and there's some quiz questions to answer next.